I'm David Partika and I created CSS Burner, and today I'm going to explain to you how to interpret all of the colored warning indicators and error indicators that you'll get after using the scan option to scan a block of CSS. So the icon for scan is the top leftmost icon, and I already have a block of CSS that's been pasted into the text area. So let's go ahead and select our options. They've all been pre-selected because I have my scan settings saved. So we're going to look for the presence of SVG and accelerated mobile page elements. We're going to allow for the detection of warning level indicators, optimizations, and we're going to check URLs. So we click the scan button, and within a second, we see that there are a series of different kind of errors, warnings, and optimizations. So let's go through all the different colors and explain exactly what they mean. Now, anytime you want to correlate something that's in the output window with something that's in the report window, we can double click on a non-mobile device. We can double click the highlighted portion, or on a mobile device we can just tap. So starting from the top, we see that there is an orange bold highlighted segment in this first selector or declaration block, and when we mouse over what the highlighted portion is, we'll see a small little tooltip give us a brief explanation about what's the problem. In this case, this is orange, so this is an optimization, and we're told that the quotation marks are not necessary, which is true. Whenever you are lacking in an attribute selector any escapable characters, for example, if your attribute selector is just equal to something that's, say, alphanumeric, no space characters, no punctuation characters, we can, in most cases, it depends on the punctuation characters, but we can omit the quotation marks. So these are two characters that did not have to be included. We double click and we see that the report window has scrolled down to the optimization section, and we get a brief explanation about exactly what is the problem. So we can get more information by going to the information icon. So that is an optimization, and now let's go to the next block, and we see that there is an inserted green segment, which when we mouse over, we see that the tooltip tells us that an identifier is needed here, and this is true. If you go to the documentation for keyframes, which you can find by double-clicking on the highlighted portion and going to the information icon, you need an identifier in the syntax for the @keyframes rule. And so in this block of code that was scanned, there was no identifier present. So this very obvious green inserted substring string was meant to let us know that, hey, you need something here. So whenever there is a missing identifier or a missing right brace or a semicolon, that will be inserted in green. So let's move on to the next block. Here we see a couple things going on. One is we see a property that is unknown, and the problem here is that there is no display property with two Y's at the end. That does not exist. So double clicking, we get to the error, which is that this property is not known, at least for this particular selector, and that is an error. You need to have display with one Y, and otherwise nothing's going to render the way that you want it to with a display none. Now, here we have the property value, and the tooltip tells us that green with 3 E's is not a valid color. Double click, and we see that there's a brief explanation. We could get more information by clicking on the informational icon. And finally, we notice that to close the declaration block, we only needed one right brace, but instead we have two right braces. Now, these kind of things do happen. I've looked at a lot of style sheets. I've scanned several style sheets, and on occasion, you do get repeated characters that were probably just some kind of typo and the authors didn't realize it. So any error that is in the form of a repeated symbol, which will cause CSS to break, that's the key. It has to cause the CSS to break somehow. This is going to be underlined in red. That is an error. And so we double click it and we see that we're scrolled in the report to, okay, you have repeat right brace symbols. Okay, moving on to the next block. We notice that there's an orange box around the contents of the declaration block, and this is because the rule display none is a repeated declaration block, and if we scan our CSS, we notice that, yes, the first rule, there is a display none. So what we could have done is we could have just used a comma to separate the selectors class 1, which is a class, and this other class, which has as a further filter, it has the title attribute. These two selectors could have been comma separated and combined into one declaration instead of separated into two, and that's unnecessary or redundant markup that will cause your CSS file to be bigger than it needs to be. Okay, so moving on, we see for the next block, there is an inserted semicolon. When you have properties followed by a colon and a value for the properties, if you have more than one of these in a declaration block, they need to be separated by a semicolon. And if they're not, I've written an algorithm that detects a most likely position as far as where the semicolon should have been, and it will insert that semicolon. So we see it has been inserted after block, but before the color property, which is right here. Okay, the next rule we see is a media rule, and here is something new. It's a yellow highlighted media type here. Embossed is no longer something that that needs to be declared. It's deprecated, this media type, and it's not wrong. It's not incorrect to include this in your markup. So no CSS will break if you have this included, but it's just not something that the W3C has decided will be a media type going forward. So it has been deprecated, and it's been highlighted here in yellow. Now finally, moving on to the last block, we see that there's a class selector, and the contents have some markup, some highlighted markup in here. We see for the color property, there is an optimization because it's highlighted in bolded in orange. And so we put the mouse and get the tooltip to explain what's going on, or we could also double click to get further explanation, but the tooltip tells us all that we need to know. This is a hex color code that whenever you have a sequence that is 6 consecutive characters that are identical, you can rewrite that as 3 characters. So for example, this hashtag 0 6 times could have been written hashtag 0 3 times. Now, there are other rules for shortening hex codes, but and I'm not going to talk about that here. All you need to know is that this is a shortenable hex code, so it's optimizable. 3 characters could have been chopped off, and the CSS file could have been shorter. So this is an optimization. Now, we notice here a highlighted property in yellow, so this is a warning level indicator. This is a property that was repeated in the block, and we notice right above color was included. The purpose of this is just to give you a heads up that, hey, this property has been repeated in this block. I don't know if you're aware of that, but just in case you're not, just be aware that this block has been repeated. Now, I know in most cases, it's just simply to get maximum browser coverage, because the different browsers have different, rules as far as what they accept or allowable values. So a lot of times you'll see, for example, with a linear gradient, you'll see background with the different prefixed linear gradients over and over again. So that's something that was intended by the author. In this case, this is obviously for demonstration purposes, and so it could be intended, it might not be, and it's just an FYI that this is a repeat. And finally, we see again a repeated symbol, but this is something that is not necessary. It's not going to cause an error in this case. So repeated semicolons will not cause any errors with parsing CSS, but they're just not necessary. So first of all, you don't need to include semicolons at the end of a declaration block. But secondly, when you do include semicolons to separate property value pairs, you only need one semicolon. But if you put in multiple semicolons, which I didn't know until a couple months ago, if you put in multiple semicolons, you can put in as many as you want, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's pointless as far as I know. So that's been flagged and underlined here in yellow as a warning. So these are all the different kinds of error and warning and optimization indicators that you'll get in CSS Burner. I don't have any plans to add any right now, but if you found this video helpful, just please give it a thumbs up, and you can subscribe to my channel, or you can subscribe to the CSS Burner newsletter by going to the top left of the home page and entering your email address and clicking the subscribe button. So thank you for your time, and I hope this was useful.